So how do we know if this is happening? What do we need to do to figure it out? Well, right here's number one. If you suspect this, you need to get a culture. And if you have a lot of GI symptoms, okay, you need to get a culture of your stool. And ideally, in this scenario, you want a 3-day culture, a 3-day stool sample, not a 1-day sample. A lot of doctors want to do a 1-day sample, and the problem, 1 day may be misleading. You may not find what you're looking for. 3 days, you're much more likely to find it if it's truly a problem. So again, when you're going to your doctor to ask for testing, ask for a 3-day sample culture of your stool. Okay, and don't, one of the things it's become very popular recently is what's called PCR testing of the stool. In my opinion, this type of testing, it can be helpful, but it's not very helpful in diagnostics. You want a culture. A culture is not the same thing as a PCR. And a lot of companies now are they're just skipping the culture part and they're trying to do the PCR. And PCR is fraught with technological problems that can lead to a false or misaccurate diagnosis. So just be aware of that. Now, the other thing that you want to consider is, beyond the culture, is a microscopy. And this is where when you give your 3-day sample, this is a poop test, right? So you give your 3-day sample, and the pathologist will actually look at your sample under a microscope, because this is another way. Sometimes cultures, they have to grow. Cultures, sometimes they don't grow. You try to get a culture and it won't grow. And so a microscopy, which is a visible confirmation of yeast presence, can also be helpful when the cultures come back false negative. So, if you're trying to be as accurate as you can be, there's no such thing as a perfect lab, but, again, the more your doctor knows, the more about these types of things, the more accurate they can get. But a culture plus a microscopy is a good tool to use, so that in case you miss the culture, if the culture doesn't grow, you can still see the yeast visibly and then deal with it in that way. Now, you can also do blood antibody tests, and there are also stool antibody tests that can be done. And so this could be done in the stool or the blood, because sometimes the yeast will get into the I said bleed and say blood. Sometimes sometimes yeast can get into the blood, but stool cultures and antibody tests, and so there are different kinds of antibodies. There's IgA, IgG, IgM are the most common antibody tests that are run for things like Candida or different species of Candida. And then there's, again, microscopic evaluation, which is what I was referring to down here. And of course, just visiting your doctor and having them look at you, look in your mouth and look at your nail beds, because sometimes, what I showed you today are very obvious pictures of fungal infection, but sometimes it's a little more nuanced and it's not quite so obvious. So a good doctor examination is also a very, very good idea. So if you suspect, if you've got an autoimmune disease, if you're gluten-free and your problem's not getting better and you're still persistently having symptoms and you haven't had this done, this is definitely something that you want to consider, because if you do have a Candida overgrowth or some other form of yeast overgrowth, then you could have an autobrewery that's leading to a lot of the problems that we talked about today. So let's talk about next what the solution is. So how to bring balance back to your microbiome. If this is happening, what can we do? Number one is keep your carbs to a more reasonable amount. Now, you can go low carb. You could do something like keto or carnivore, but I always like to keep people at least at 33% of their total calories as carbohydrates or less. So you can go less than 33%, but just keep it under 33%. It's my experience that if you keep it under 33%, you can still get rid of yeast. Avoid alcohol. It feeds them. Avoid gluten. Beyond the potential problems linked to gluten-based foods are going to feed yeast overgrowth. Ask your doctor if your current medications could be contributing to immunosuppression leading to the propagation of Candida species. Eat seasonally. By eating seasonally, you eat fresher. The food you get is more nutrient dense. It's going to support you nutritionally. Get sunshine. Yeast don't like sunshine. This is especially true if you have them growing on your nail beds or growing on your skin. UV light and red light are very powerful antifungals. Sleep. Remember, your immune system relies on healthy sleep to function well. Drink filtered clean water and have your indoor air quality checked, because one of the common issues associated with yeast overgrowth as well is environmental mold. And so if you've got excessive mold or you're not controlling your air quality in your home, you could have immune suppressive problems linked to that as well. Now, beyond those fundamental things that you should just be doing all the time, there are some natural things that you can also do. There's some natural supplements that you can take to support a healthy microbiome, especially as it relates to yeast. And so some of the things I've just listed out here: caprylic acid. There's a type of probiotic that contains something called Saccharomyces boulardii. And so this is actually competitive for yeast. It competes with Candida for the growth. So this is a probiotic strain that a lot of times you can buy these over the counter, but can have a kind of a yeast balancing effect. Vitamin C has antifungal properties, and so I like vitamin C for a lot of things, but this is one of the reasons why. Berberine and oregano have antifungal properties. Artemisia drenuncula and Tinospora cordifolia and horsetail and thyme or Thymus vulgaris and olive leaf. These are all just natural plant-based options, from here to here, that help support a healthy balance of the microbiome away from yeast. You see a little bit here in terms of research, application of probiotic yeasts on Candida species-associated infection. Clinical studies have further confirmed the in vitro and in vivo activity of the probiotic yeast against Candida species. So what is a probiotic yeast? It's this right here. It's that S. boulardii that I was just talking about. So again, probiotics use a variety of protective mechanisms, including posing a physical barrier, the ability to aggregate pathogens and render them avirulent, in other words, to neutralize their capacity to hurt you. Secreted metabolites such as short-chain fatty acids. Talked about this historically, we've talked about this quite a bit. One of the most important short-chain fatty acids is butyrate or butyric acid. And this is very important, and this stuff is made by your good bacteria. Your bifidobacter and your lactobacillus species of bacteria actually increase the production of butyrate. So again, this is one of the mechanisms of why probiotics are so beneficial and helpful, and why taking antibiotics potentially could reverse that trend and lower your butyrate, because it's knocking out your good bacteria's ability to produce it. But you can see short-chain fatty acids effectively inhibit the adhesion and morphological transition of Candida. So what happens when Candida comes in, initially it sticks its little fingers into the cracks, if you will, of the cells in your gut. So it kind of penetrates in, and so as it lands in on your cells, it gets its sticky little fingers in there, and it works its way through, and it starts to replicate, and then it can form and secrete something called a biofilm, and this way your immune system can't get to it, because remember, 70+% of your immune system's in your gut. So if these are gut cells here, it's just invading in that region. And so again, this is where short-chain fatty acids like butyrate prevent these yeast cells from sticking to the surface of the small intestine and large intestinal cell lining. And so the probiotic yeast could be a promising, effective alternative or combination therapy for Candida. Additional studies would bolster the application of probiotic yeast. So consider that as a natural way to support your microbiome, keeping it healthy. And then we've got some additional research just on the effects I've mentioned earlier. I mentioned caprylic acid, and I mentioned carvacrol and thyme. What they do is they effectively help to neutralize pathological Candida albicans by disrupting their cell membranes. So they basically poke little holes in the cell membranes of Candida albicans, helping to keep them from growing out of control. So there's research on these natural things, again, that you can do in your own life. You can also eat some of these things. You can eat food with oregano in it, and obviously you can eat vitamin C rich foods. You can eat caprylic acid rich foods. Coconut would be an example of a caprylic acid rich food. Or you can also supplement with these things should you choose to do so. But at the end of the day, again, let's go back to the core message. If you have autoimmunity, if you've changed your diet, if you continue to struggle, and nobody's ever measured whether or not you have Candida or other forms of yeast overgrowth, this is something you really want to talk to your doctor about, because it can be a major, major trigger for persistent autoimmune reactivity. And if you're trying to overcome that and you're hitting a roadblock and you haven't looked at Candida, it's definitely something you want to consider.